From baggage claim to pajamas in 10 minutes. Erie International Airport. Fly with ERI.com.
Fly Erie International Airport to Charlotte on American Airlines, your nonstop gateway to the world. Also, we have Breeze Airways flying nonstop to Orlando and Tampa, Florida. A great low-cost carrier providing excellent service to the regional community. Fly Erie International for your travel needs.
Fly with ERI.com.
All year round, Frontier Home Products and Design has what you need to make your home comfortable and beautiful. Relax on a new timber tech deck designed by Frontier's experts. A new fireplace from Frontier Home Products Fireplace Gallery adds warmth and serenity to any home. Beauty and versatility at Frontier Home Products and Design Center, 4213 Peachtree, East 5th, next to the Bayfront Highway.
Frontier Home Products and Design Center. Discover a new frontier.
PA contractor number PA039007.
Welcome to TalkErie.com's Joel Natale Show, Erie, Pennsylvania's daily podcast. Every day, we tackle the biggest issues that the Erie, PA region faces. Stay informed and involved as we advance the narrative of Erie. Now, here's Joel Natale.
A very interesting conversation with political and presidential historian and the former executive director of the Hagen History Center, George Deutsch. George, good to see you, sir. Appreciate it, man.
Nice to see you too, Joel.
All right, so go figure. This 2024 election, as we talked about in July, is nothing like we've ever seen in a lot of ways. Although that's my hypothesis. It's your turn to be able to kind of blow it up.
Well, I'll say that it is certainly a controversial election.
Yeah. But
we have had a number of other contentious elections which make this one pale in comparison, quite frankly. There have been just some miserable elections. I'll give you a first example off the top of my head. Andrew Jackson, who ran against four others, won the most votes in the Electoral College and most votes in the popular, but a couple of his rivals teamed up against him. It got thrown to the House of Representatives, and he eventually lost. But what was particularly nasty, a very nasty election in general, but his wife had been previously married. She had been divorced. She had signed the divorce papers. And you're talking about rural western Kentucky when it was actually, I think, still a territory. Eventually, her first husband never got around to signing the papers and sending them to the courthouse until after Jackson was actually running. And so Jackson's opponents just were brutal on her, not only talking about bigamy, but they are calling her a whore. And
my word.
I mean, it went on and on and on. Eventually, this is the second term, it's the second time Jackson ran, but it was his first term that he won. The stress that came upon her by all of this horrible attacks caused her to have a heart attack and die before he was inaugurated. So, there are instances where it's worse.
That is shocking. You're saying, I mean, yeah, just to call, just to totally destroy her character. That's unreal.
And there are plenty more examples of that.
Is there really?
Oh, there are. I taught a full course at the Jefferson and at Chautauqua about the most contentious presidential elections, and I think I had 8 of them in there, and I had to call a couple of them because I just didn't have time to do more than 8. But the reason I created the course was to show that there were many more instances in American history where things were uglier than they are now politically.
The when you talk about the the back and forth, even at the founding, right? We had They hated I mean, like Adams, they hated Adams, or Jefferson hated Hamilton. I mean, you get all this stuff about the founding fathers. They were not all kumbaya,
No, actually, after George Washington, the factions, as they called them then, just went in completely opposite directions. The election of 1800, which is Jefferson running against the incumbent John Adams, is one of the ones that I have talked about in my course, and it was a brutal election. They hired writers to, create dirt on the other guy. There was all kinds of nasty personal stuff that went on. Plus Adams was wanting to establish a monarchy, and Jefferson was, pro all the excesses of the French Revolution, guillotining his opponents, and
I'm sorry, that's hilarious.
Oh yeah, I mean it gets worse. I do almost a whole hour of just on that one election. So you're right. Founding fathers. What's interesting is they reconciled years later, Jefferson and Adams, and they died on the 4th of July, 50 years to the day. They both died the same day, 50 years to the day after the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
That's remarkable. That is, I had heard that before, and I'm like, how is that ever possible? But that's exactly right. I want to go back to Jackson here, because maybe one of the most repeated analogies is Donald Trump is the 21st century's Andrew Jackson. Do you see that in your knowledge about Jackson?
Oh, I think there's some similarities. Tell you a story, and I thought of this after that Punk took the shot at Trump in the summer. A man approached Jackson walking through the Capitol and pulled out a gun and tried to shoot him, and the gun jammed. And Jackson, of course, there was no Secret Service around him. He literally took his cane and swatted the guy's gun, and then he started beating him with the cane until his aides came over and pulled him off of him. So, the fight thing, that's kind of what reminded me of how that went. Again, that's remarkable that, again, there was no security. And we've got to remember that really, I mean, there was Secret Service, but, all the way up to 1963, I mean, we didn't keep our presidents in bubbles, did we? No, the Secret Service was created during the Civil War, and a guy named Lafayette Baker was the first head of it. But its purpose was not presidential protection at the time. And Lincoln really had been, I think, going back to when he was first elected, and Alan Pinkerton, the famous detective, was kind of in charge of his security, and he warned Lincoln that there was going to be an assassination attempt in Baltimore. Baltimore did not have a through train. You had to come down on the what would become the Pennsylvania Railroad, get off, go about a mile across town to Camden Yards, and then take the other train in. Wow. And where Camden Yards is today, where the Orioles play, is where the second station was. The first one was the Presidential Street Station. Anyway, so Lincoln was warned. He took a different train. It was said he was in disguise, and he got a lot of criticism. And as a result, I think ever after that, it was such that Lincoln felt that he had to somehow show his manlyhood by not surrounding himself. As a matter of fact, on the grounds of the Soldiers' Home in Washington, Northeast Washington, on a really nice hill, is a cemetery for deceased soldiers and what became the presidential summer house. And it's about a mile and a half, 2 miles from the White House. And the family stayed up there during the summer. It had a nice view before it got built up, and a nice breeze from the swamp that was surrounding the White House. And Lincoln actually used to ride alone on his horse back and forth to work. There was a point that somebody took a shot at him.
Wow.
And he had, as he rode up to the gate of the National Soldiers Home, the guards there, came rushing down because they'd heard a shot, and they went several hundred yards down the road and found his hat with a bullet hole through it.
Holy mackerel. That's unreal. Again, these stories are incredible that our presidents have endured these kinds of things. Can you talk about the only president ever coming from Pennsylvania was James Buchanan, and he's pretty much known as the worst president in American history.
Certainly one of the bottom five.
He didn't run for re-election, I'm assuming, right?
No.
So talk about the election of 60. Again, you're at the cusp of Civil War. I mean, what was the tenor? Again, I'm not saying that we're at the cusp of Civil War by any stretch, but I'm interested in when people make these hyperbolic comparisons, let's give them the real deal here, George.
Well, again, one of my classes, which I use as standalone too, is what I call America's most consequential presidential election, and that's the one in 1860, which led us to the Civil War. There had been a series of situations when I'm not going to go for an hour here to lecture you on that
right.
one. But starting with the Mexican War, then the Compromise of 1850 to try to keep things together, then the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each one of those further divided us. But then there were a series through the 1850s of some very significant things. I guess the first one, as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was based on the theory that each new territory coming into the country would vote for its constitution being free soil or slave, and Kansas was the first one. And a lot of Missourians from the slave state crossed the border to try to help vote Kansas into as a slave state. The Free Soilers came in, money, people, and there were multiple constitutions that were adopted. It was called Bleeding Kansas because it really was, I consider, the first shots of the Civil War in the mid-1850s. John Brown, who people may remember from Harper's Ferry, he and his sons came out from Pennsylvania, actually. They shortly before that, they'd been living down in Crawford County. He had a tannery there. But
abolitionists,
strong abolitionists, violent abolitionists. And he was nicknamed Potawatomi Brown because at a long Potawatomi Creek in Kansas, he personally murdered 5 men and boys who were pro-slavery with a broadsword. So that then led a couple of years on to the Dred Scott decision, which was perhaps the most controversial decision in the history of the Supreme Court. That was followed then by the Browns' raid on Harper's Ferry, which tried to create what they called a servile insurrection, or basically a slave revolt. And each one of those, if you had laid out a line of gunpowder, you kept throwing matches on that gunpowder as it went. And finally, you want to talk about factions. You split the Democratic Party between the Northern Democrats who were pro-union. They didn't really care much about slavery either way. The Southern Democrats who were strongly pro-slavery. and they had a convention in Charleston, South Carolina, and they had 50-some ballots, and they couldn't decide. And so they reconvened 2 months later in Baltimore, and again, multiple ballots. They couldn't decide. Finally, the Southern Democrats walked out, went a couple blocks down to a fire station, nominated their own candidate, who was John Breckinridge, the sitting vice president of the United States, who was a slaveholder from Kentucky. And then the rest of the Democrats, the Northern Democrats.
Buchanan was not a Democrat? Or he was?
Buchanan was.
Okay, but he was a Northern Democrat.
He was a Northern Democrat, but he actually supported his vice president during the election.
During the 60
But,
election.
So the Northern Democrats voted to put Stephen Douglas up. Douglas was, at that point, perhaps the most powerful senator. The Republicans put up Lincoln. People think that the Republicans were an abolitionist party. There was a faction. But what they don't realize is that the Republicans said, no, you can keep things as they are. You just can't expand slavery. Mm-hmm. And so that was the Republican platform with Lincoln. And then a fourth candidate pops up, a guy by the name of Bell, who had been the Speaker of the House. He'd been the Secretary of War. He was a senator from Tennessee, another slaveholder, but he created the Constitutional Union Party. And all they wanted to do was preserve the Union come hell or high water. They didn't, they didn't put anything about slavery in their particular platform or any other issue. It was just preserved. So he got a lot of votes in what you'd consider the border states at the time. He won Virginia, Kentucky, and I think a couple. And
we were still by that point we were doing popular votes for the president, to do the Electoral College, right? This was not the House voting,
right? No, the House only would come in if the Electoral College was split.
Yeah.
So basically,
we had a four-way race.
Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in all but 2 counties throughout the entire South except for Virginia, and he got about 1,800 votes in what would become West Virginia, but not on the ballot anyplace else. He would win every northern state except for Missouri and half of New Jersey. New Jersey split its vote, but he'd only got 39% of the popular vote. Now the other 3 further split the popular vote.
Right.
Douglas, interestingly enough, had the second highest. He had 29%, but because he came in second place to Lincoln throughout the North, he actually had the lowest electoral votes. It was a very odd situation, but ultimately Lincoln, because the northern states had accumulated so many votes in the Electoral College because of their population, basically, he won a clear majority in the Electoral College, but only won 39% of the popular vote.
So he did get the majority. He didn't get a plurality, but a majority of the Electoral College votes.
Right.
Wow.
Because if it had been a plurality, it would have gotten tossed into the House of Representatives.
We've got George Deutsch with us here on Talk Erie and the Joel Natale Show. We're talking about getting some perspective on the presidential race from a presidential historian here. George, I want you to finish your story about 1860. Again, we're trying to give you give our audience a little bit of an understanding that, things have been worse. We're not at the brink of civil war here because things were a lot worse in 1860. Go ahead, George.
So once Lincoln was elected, and again, he wasn't on the ballot in any of the southern states, South Carolina led the way in seceding from the Union. They did it, I think, on December 30th of 1860, 6 weeks or so after Lincoln's election. And then you had a 4-month gap between the election and the inauguration. The inauguration didn't come until March 4th. Now, with Franklin Roosevelt, they cut that in half. But it wasn't until then.
It wasn't until Roosevelt.
So
wow.
during that 4-month period, 7 of the southern states seceded, the states in the Deep South. Chief Justice Taney, who was a rival and antagonist with Lincoln. Again, there's a great lecture about the two of them, and it's not a pretty scene. You think that today's president and the Supreme Court, you should have seen it back in the late 1800s. But anyway, so Taney and President Buchanan both agreed that the southern states had no right to secede, but they also agreed that the federal government couldn't do anything about it. So we had 4 months of no action from the federal government while all these 7 southern states seceded. And by the time Lincoln was inaugurated, we're literally on the brink of civil war. There'd been a convention in Washington to attempt to bring the sides together, but the fire eaters in the South and the radical abolitionists in the North just kept pulling the country apart. And then just a month after Lincoln is inaugurated, I think maybe 5 weeks, Fort Sumter is fired upon. He calls for volunteers to put down the rebellion, and then 4 more southern states secede.
Wow.
So we're not on that. We're not going to have
we're not
that
in that
sort
footing.
of situation.
Thank goodness too, because obviously that was the bloodiest war of America's ever been in, and I someday we'll do a whole show on this, because I'd like to know, how to, at one point you've got sitting senators from the South, then they probably vanish to go to the Confederate Senate, and then you have to figure out who's on whose side with your military construct.
Get paid to drive. Start a new career behind the wheel at the EMTA. If you are looking for a high-paying and rewarding career with full benefits and paid training, stop by or apply online today with the EMTA. Plus, EMTA riders can now enjoy free Wi-Fi on new, clean, and environmentally friendly buses to travel all over Erie County. Visit ridethee.com for more information.
Get on board EMTA. Get on board EMTA. Get
Quickfill gasoline is made right here in America. United Refining Company, who operates Quickfill, refines its gasoline from North American crude oil in Warren, Pennsylvania. When you buy United Refining Company gasoline at Quickfill, you keep jobs and businesses in America, and you keep American families strong. You don't need to send your money overseas when you buy gasoline. Buy American-made gasoline at Quickfill. Quickfill, driving America.
We've seen a lot of our candidates. So Kamala Harris has been here the last couple of weeks. Within the month or so, we've heard from President Trump. Both vice presidential candidates have made 2 visits each. Is there, from your just kind of anecdotally, did Erie ever play prominently in campaigns? I mean, we have to always talk about JFK coming to the Lawrence Hotel, right?
Right, but quite frankly, no. I don't think we ever played such a prominent role, but we have been a bellwether, and the national media has caught on to us being a bellwether, and as a result, the candidates have kind of stood up and took notice. Mm-hmm. And so we've gotten more presidential visits, candidate visits than I think that we ever did combined in our history. I mean, this is pretty amazing. Yeah. And this round is even more so than the last couple of elections.
No, I would agree. I'm thinking about like FDR or Truman coming in on a whistle stop. You get 15 minutes at the tracks,
right?
and away they go to Cleveland, right?
Now, obviously, I was not going to Cathedral Prep at the time when Kennedy came in. I'm not quite that old, but I remember, the priests talking about the school letting out, and all the boys were expected to go down for the to see Kennedy in Perry Square.
Yeah, I would love to go back and see what those what that vote was in Erie, Pennsylvania for JFK.
It was heavily for JFK that time.
Pretty amazing, considering that Nixon, some say, won the election, but we're not going to get into election denialism right now. Let's talk about the Electoral College. And I'm just going to, be forefront here. I'm still a big believer in the Electoral College. I think otherwise we would basically have one candidate after another from California, New York, dominating these races here. But talk about the origination. Why did the founders feel like they needed to do this? Because I'm hearing that it's all about slavery.
No, absolutely not. What happened was in 1787, we had been under the Articles of Confederation, and they just had too weak of a federal government, and it just wasn't working. So they created, this federal authority, as they called it, created a federal convention. It wasn't even supposed to originally be a constitutional convention, and it was called to address the deficiencies of the Articles. Eventually, it evolved into the delegates creating a completely new constitution in 1787 in that hot, humid Philadelphia. So the Constitution created the government that we know today. There were heated debates almost every aspect of the new document. After the delegates were finished, the new Constitution would take 2 years, 1789, to ratify for the 13 states to adopt. With the proviso, many of the states only signed on with the proviso that the first 10 amendments, which we know as the Bill of Rights, were included. So the modern presidency was created by the convention, and there were really heated debates over the nature of the presidential election. And there were,
and so it's really important that people understand, between 1776 and declaring independence and when the Constitution was adopted, there was no presidency. Was there a chief executive?
There was no chief executive. There was a presidency, but it's not the same as we know it. It basically was a rotating presidency. Whoever was elected as the head delegate of the under the Articles of Confederation.
Okay.
So there were 7 American presidents before George Washington.
I have never heard this before. I never knew that.
Yeah.
Okay, keep going.
So the arguments at the convention were, how do you elect a president? And there was by arguments of direct popular vote. It was for Congress to choose the president like a parliament would, or a variety of notions with the states choosing the executive. As for the direct popular vote, there is some support for that, but there's also great opposition. The arguments focused against voting by, this is a quote, unlettered people swayed by a few active and designing men. The population at large was seen as not having the, quote, requisite capacity to choose wisely. No agreement was reached by the delegates as a whole. Ultimately, it was turned over to what was called the Special Committee on Postponed Matters.
Okay.
After much debate, the fateful compromise was agreed to, and that was the Electoral College. Each state, quote, in a manner of its own devising, would select electors equal to its total congressional delegation. The House, which is based on population, plus the 2 senators. The key compromise was how the number of electors were determined. The smaller states were concerned that the larger states at that time, Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia, would dominate the presidency by their sheer population size, something that you alluded to when you asked me the question.
Yeah.
Thus, by adding in the 2 senators, each gave the smaller states some leveling of the EC, both individually and collectively. The compromise allowed each state to select its own system of electors, either by popular vote or by appointment of the state legislatures.
So the states could choose how they chose the electors.
Right. And up until the early part of the 20th century, the state legislators chose the senators. The popular vote was only window dressing for the Senate up until I think it was 1913.
Wow.
So we all know James Madison, President of the United States, was also considered the father of the Constitution. He would become the fourth president. He later said that the Electoral College was the decision made in part from, and this is a quote from Madison, a degree of the hurrying influence produced by fatigue and impatience. Oh. Ever since, it's been the Electoral College has been the key to shaping the presidential elections. It's the Electoral College for better or worse.
Okay, so that kind of weakens the modern case for the Electoral College to see if it was, basically made out of desperation.
Right, because
Wow.
the delegates couldn't agree. So they
Right.
turned it over to this special committee, and they hammered it out.
Do you know who? I mean, was Hamilton involved in any of this? Do you know of, or
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think he was on that committee.
interesting? I mean, so how what's a good way to frame this modern conversation about the Electoral College? Do you think?
Well, again, remember this was created 1787.
Yeah.
And I think the arguments in some ways are very much the same because we have the smaller states who get more representation individually proportionally, than their population shows. Mm-hmm. And today, we've got these half dozen or 7 states that are considered these swing states. You notice that the biggest states, California, Florida, New York, Illinois, Texas, none of them are considered swing states. If we had no Electoral College, those states would be dominating. That's where the presidential candidates would be going all the time to get the biggest bang for their buck, essentially trying to drum up votes.
Yeah. I find it interesting, Pennsylvania has always been in play for presidential politics, but it was like we started the conversation with, it wasn't always this consequential. You go back to, 2000, and it's Tim Russert's famous Florida. Florida was an absolute purple state. I mean, it was hard to pin down, right?
Right.
Now Florida is extremely a red state. Ohio the same way. 2004, I want to say, or
right. 2004 was when it was thought that John Kerry had won the state of Ohio. It was thought that he would win the presidency.
Yeah.
And ever since then, Ohio has voted consistently for Republican.
So there's this question of, should Donald Trump win Pennsylvania this time? Would it indicate an absolute move to the Republicans for PA, that PA would become solidly red?
No, I think it's too close, and I think we've got too many folks on both sides. Although what's surprising to me is that the Democrats, for all of my memory, have had a majority as far as voter registration.
Absolutely.
And that has shrunk considerably over the last 4 years, which when I heard that statistic, I was a little surprised. But I think the Democrats still have more voter registration than the Republicans do statewide. I think Pennsylvania is truly a purple state, although we have a governor and 2 senators who are Democrats.
Right.
So I don't think that if Trump ekes out a victory by a point or 2 in Pennsylvania, I don't think it's a harbinger that Pennsylvania is going to, go totally red by any means.
I want you to also weigh in, and if there's any anything that lines up with this in history of it not necessarily being a difference between political parties, but also like elites versus common man, because we're starting to see that now, where it used to be the Democrats could draw, white working men and women, and now that's kind of been diffused, and you have Democrats drawing more educated, more upper class, especially white women in the educated class. Is there anything analog to that in history as far as classism? And I mean, they talk about the country club Republicans. I'm thinking of Nelson Rockefeller and that kind of thing.
Well, that's true. New York and California used to be heavily Republican, but of course they are completely the opposite of that today. I think again, your analogy, if you go back 64 years to 1960, you very much had the Democrats representing the working class and the Republicans representing more of the educated and really,
the business people, the Chamber of Commerce, Nixon,
and it
right?
really has flipped.
Yeah.
And you hear about Elon Musk and some other billionaires. There's more billionaires today supporting Ms. Harris than there are Mr. Trump.
Yeah.
And the flip is astounding. And there was a point. Let's look at the black vote.
Okay.
For decades, the black vote was heavily Republican.
I was going to say Jackie Robinson. I want to say was an Ike man, right?
Yeah, and so what happened? Of course, Jim Crow laws and all basically drove blacks out of the voting booth in the South until the 1960s, the 1964 Voting Rights Act. But it was, interestingly enough, it was Franklin Roosevelt who flipped the black vote from Republican to Democrat. And there are various reasons. Again, we don't have time to get into it.
Yeah.
But that, for, again, 80 years was a solid Republican bloc, and then it flipped. And now maybe some of it is slipping on the Democrat side. We don't really know until let's see the results of this election and maybe another election or two after that.
And they're saying only even a movement of 5 to 10%.
Oh, that's
is massive.
Yeah, I see this as a very interesting election in the voter blocks because, again, you have slippage for the Democrats from blacks and Latinos and unions, but you have a significant slippage for the Republicans from, I we'll call it the never Trumper Republicans, the people that just can't stand him. And again, suburban women are a big part of that. So it depends on, which group or which party loses less of their base in this case. Because if the never Trumpers weren't there, I think that the Republicans would have a huge leg up. But as it turns out, there's a lot of people on the Republican side who have an R after their name, can't stand the man. Yeah. So it's an election like I've never seen before.
I want you to weigh in on divided government because, believe it or not, I've been thinking back to Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, 1994. And the concept of divided government actually getting things done to the point that in 1999 we had a balanced budget, and that's what George W. Bush inherited before 9/11. Are there other I mean, because I know like FDR was, just getting pummeled by the Republicans in Congress. But are there other examples where things could get done in a divided government?
Oh, I think so. As much as people remember Richard Nixon for his paranoia and Tricky Dick and all those sort of things, he worked with a Democratic Congress throughout his first term and into his second term. There are people in the Senate like Scoop Jackson, for instance, and others who were willing to work, essentially for the greater good. You compromised, maybe you got a bill through that would then trend your vote, for something else.
Right.
There's a lot of push and pull. There's a lot less ideological partisanship. There's always partisanship, but it was not quite so ideological. And when you get ideological, like they seem to be going through now, that's when not a lot gets done.
Talk to about, again, you spent a lot of time in the Beltway, this concept of, it really doesn't matter who's at the top of, who's in the Oval, because there's this permanent the military industrial complex, the government industrial complex, where basically, the negative term is the deep state. That's a horrible term, but, are there things where that, no matter who's at the top or even who's the secretary of that department, things are just going to always be the same?
I think that's an issue. And I think perhaps that's why people inside the Beltway, where I used to live and where I still have a house, I think that's where the folks that live inside the Beltway are so terrified of Trump, because they actually believe that he's going to come in and make changes. Now, there have been opportunities in the past, commissions and whatnot, to make changes, but the bureaucracy always seems to survive. I think there's real fear that it may not this time from the folks who would be most affected for their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, every organization of a certain age has bloat. Trump saying, threatening 10,000, having a government force less 10,000, which that's a drop in the bucket, isn't it?
I mean, if you're talking 10 or 20%, then it gets serious.
Yeah. And then, of course, Elon Musk, touting that he could cut $2 trillion from the budget. That remains to be seen, because Trump didn't have a balanced budget in his first term at all.
And there, the Grace Commission, and there are other attempts to shave the size of the bureaucracy, and no one has ever succeeded in doing that.
I mean, they even, what was it, under Obama, they had sequestration, I think that's how you call it, where basically if you didn't pass a budget, there's going to be automatic cuts. Didn't seem to move any needles.
And I'll give you an example.
We had to wrap up, but please.
Quickly, when I was a kid, the mall in Washington, which we all know, was full of buildings. They looked like Quonset huts. And they had been left over from World War II, and they were called temporary buildings. And so when I was a kid, 20 plus years after World War II, they were still there, and they were still full of government employees. So the government, the Army shrank, but the government really didn't shrink after Roosevelt.
Unreal. That's unreal. All right. Are you up for a prediction, or, I'm not going to ask you who's going to win, but I'm going to ask you, how will the country react to who wins?
That's a tough question. I think that there are going to be angry people on both sides. The only hope we can have is that those angry people don't get stupid and start to create violence.
Yeah.
Because we need a peaceful transition, no matter who wins.
And, and that's a history that we don't want to repeat, right, George?
Absolutely.
George Deutsch, our presidential historian. Thanks for taking the time, sir.
Good to see you, Joel.
You've been listening to The Joel Natale Show, Erie, Pennsylvania's daily podcast from TalkErie.com. Subscribe to our show on your favorite podcatcher and get involved by emailing joel@talkerie.com.